Number 2. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. On March 18, 2025, the state of Louisiana carried out the execution of Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr., marking a significant moment in American capital punishment history. Hoffman was 46 years old at the time of his death, executed by nitrogen hypoxia, Louisiana's first execution in over 15 years and the first in the state to use nitrogen gas as the method of execution. This took place at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angola, and came after dramatic legal battles over the constitutionality and humaneness of the execution method itself. His execution followed nearly 3 decades on death row for the 1996 abduction, rape and murder of Mary Molly Elliott, a crime that became one of the most notorious in Louisiana's recent history. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. was born on September 1, 1978, in Louisiana. He grew up in a family of 5 children. Public records and reporting indicate that Hoffman endured a troubled and abusive childhood, marked by physical and psychological trauma. Family members later described periods of instability, and Hoffman's early years did not suggest a future involving violent crime. During high school, he was a capable student and athlete, noted for playing quarterback on the football team, and even achieved straight A's up through 11th grade. However, his life took a dramatic turn after a relationship began during his teenage years. By late 1996, shortly after graduating high school, Hoffman was employed as a valet in New Orleans, a job that placed him in the vicinity of his future victim, Mary Molly Elliott. On November 26, 1996, 18-year-old Jesse Hoffman Jr. committed the crime that would define the rest of his life. He encountered Mary Molly Elliott, age 28, an advertising executive, in New Orleans. Witness accounts and criminal filings later established that Hoffman abducted Elliott at gunpoint after she parked her car while working as a valet at a downtown garage. Elliott was forced to withdraw money from an ATM under duress, and Hoffman then drove her to a remote location in St. Tammany Parish, a rural area northeast of New Orleans. There, he sexually assaulted and murdered her. Her body was later found at a boat launch area, shot and left to die. In his initial statement to police, Hoffman claimed the sexual encounter was consensual and suggested an unknown assailant was involved, but he recanted this account in a subsequent interrogation. He later said that Elliott's death occurred during a struggle over the weapon he had used to force the abduction. In the aftermath of Elliott's disappearance and the discovery of her body, law enforcement quickly identified Hoffman as the primary suspect. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder among other charges related to the abduction and rape. A St. Tammany Parish grand jury formally indicted Hoffman on January 8, 1997. In 1998, Hoffman was brought to trial before a jury in St. Tammany Parish. The prosecution presented a detailed case based on witness testimony, forensic evidence, and Hoffman's own inconsistent statements about the crime. The brutal nature of the offense, abduction, rape, and murder, made it a capital case under Louisiana law. On June 25, 1998, the jury found Hoffman guilty of first-degree murder as charged. 2 days later, on June 27, 1998, they recommended the death penalty. The trial court formally sentenced him to death on September 11, 1998. Hoffman was then transferred to death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary on November 11, 1998. During sentencing, Hoffman's defense attorneys emphasized his history of childhood abuse and neglect, arguing it contributed to post-traumatic stress and other psychological effects. Prosecutors rejected these claims as insufficient to mitigate the severity of the crime. Following his conviction and sentencing, Hoffman remained on death row for over 2 decades as his case navigated the complex system of state and federal appeals, a process common in capital cases involving constitutional claims and procedural challenges. Although execution dates were set and postponed multiple times over the years, Louisiana had not carried out an execution in 15 years leading up to 2025 due to difficulties in obtaining lethal injection drugs and legal debates over execution methods. In response, Louisiana expanded its approved protocols to include nitrogen hypoxia and electrocution as alternatives to lethal injection. Hoffman's attorneys vigorously challenged the introduction of nitrogen hypoxia on his behalf, arguing that it violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment, as well as his religious rights as a practicing Buddhist, whose spiritual practices involved controlled breathing and meditation practices they claimed would be severely disrupted by the forced inhalation of nitrogen gas. Despite these efforts, his appeals were repeatedly denied in federal and state courts. A preliminary injunction issued on March 11, 2025 by a federal judge temporarily halted the execution on grounds of possible undue suffering, but this was overturned by the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately declined to intervene, allowing the execution to proceed. With legal challenges exhausted and the appeals process complete, a death warrant for Hoffman was formally signed, setting his execution date for March 18, 2025. In the days leading up to this date, Hoffman's supporters, family members, attorneys, and faith leaders held vigils and continued to call for clemency, or at minimum for the state to adopt a different execution method than nitrogen hypoxia. Hoffman, who had spent much of his adult life incarcerated, was allowed visits and spiritual counseling in the final days. However, he declined to make any final statement in the execution chamber, and also declined a final meal choice that was noted in press coverage of the event. On the evening of March 18, 2025, Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. was brought into the execution chamber at Louisiana State Penitentiary. Witnesses included official observers, media representatives, a spiritual advisor, and members of both the victim's family and Hoffman's supporters. Hoffman was strapped to a gurney in accordance with the nitrogen hypoxia protocol. A full-face respirator mask was fitted tightly over his face, and pure nitrogen gas began to flow. The intended effect of the gas is to displace oxygen in the lungs, causing the brain and body to lose oxygen quickly. Media witnesses reported that the gas flowed for 19 minutes before Hoffman was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. local time. Witnesses described involuntary movements like twitching, clenched fists, chest activity, and occasional head jerks during the process. While officials maintained that nitrogen hypoxia was administered effectively and without unnecessary suffering, the report of physical responses during the execution fueled ongoing debate about the humaneness of the method. The execution of Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. marked Louisiana's re-entry into active capital punishment after a long hiatus and stands as a watershed moment in Louisiana's legal history and the broader U.S. death penalty debate. The state's first use of nitrogen gas as an execution method, and only the second state to employ this controversial practice following Alabama's earlier use. Supporters of the execution, including state officials, characterized it as justice fulfilled for the victim, Mary, Molly, Elliott, her family, and those who had advocated for accountability. Governor Jeff Landry and other proponents emphasized the state's responsibility to carry out lawful sentences and deliver closure for victims' families. Opponents, including civil rights advocates, faith leaders, and many legal observers, expressed concerns that nitrogen hypoxia constituted cruel and unusual punishment, particularly given media reports from prior executions involving gasping and convulsive activity, and that its use was largely untested and controversial. His attorneys had argued that the execution method even interfered with his ability to practice his Buddhist breathing and meditation. Number 1. Anthony Todd Boyd. On October 23, 2025, the state of Alabama executed Anthony Todd Boyd, age 54, at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. The execution began in the late afternoon, and Boyd was pronounced dead around 6:33 p.m. local time. Anthony Boyd's case dated back more than 3 decades to a 1993 kidnapping and murder in Talladega County, Alabama. His execution was the 7th time the state of Alabama used nitrogen gas to carry out a capital punishment sentence, and it drew national attention due to both the nature of the crime and continuing controversies about the use of nitrogen hypoxia as a method of execution. Anthony Todd Boyd was born in 1971, making him 54 at the time of his execution in 2025. Information about his early childhood and family is limited in public records, but court filings and later advocacy coverage described him as a young man living in eastern Alabama in the early 1990s. He was 21 years old at the time of the crime that ultimately sent him to death row. Boyd had no significant prior criminal history before the events leading to his arrest and conviction. The events that led to Boyd's capital murder conviction began on July 31, 1993, in Talladega County, Alabama. On that day, Gregory, New York, Hughley, age 32, was kidnapped by a group of 4 men including Anthony Boyd over a failure to pay a $200 cocaine debt, according to prosecutors. Hughley was taken at gunpoint from Anniston, Alabama, and driven to a baseball field in nearby Munford. Prosecutors later established that Hughley was duct-taped to a bench, doused with gasoline, and set on fire, burning alive while his assailants watched. Testimony at trial indicated that Boyd helped bind Hughley's feet with tape, after which other co-defendants poured gasoline and ignited it. Hughley died as a result of the burning. This killing was not a spontaneous act but, according to prosecutors, part of a calculated effort to punish and kill Hughley in retaliation for the $200 owed. The brutality of the act and its execution were central to the charges and inculpated Boyd as an active participant in a capital murder. Law enforcement arrested Boyd and his 3 co-defendants, Sean Ingram, Keontae Cox, Marcel Ackles, in the aftermath of the discovery of Hughley's body and ensuing investigation. Boyd was charged with capital murder during a kidnapping, a charge that in Alabama carried the possibility of the death penalty. Court records show that his accomplices received prison sentences instead of death. Sean Ingram and Marcel Ackles were sentenced to life without parole, while Keontae Cox avoided the death penalty after agreeing to testify for prosecutors. Boyd's indictment stemmed from grand jury proceedings in Talladega County, and the prosecution sought the death penalty based on the heinous nature of the crime and the circumstances of Hughley's death. Anthony Boyd's capital murder trial took place in 1995 before a jury in Talladega County. The prosecution's case rested primarily on eyewitness testimony, especially that of co-defendant Keontae Cox, who testified under a plea agreement that he was present, along with Boyd and others, when Hughley was kidnapped and ultimately burned alive. Notably, no physical evidence such as fingerprints or DNA directly tied Boyd to the scene, and his defense maintained that Boyd was not the primary actor who set the fire or forced the crime. However, the jury heard testimony from Cox and other witnesses about the events leading to Hughley's death. Defense attorneys raised concerns about the reliability of the testimony, given that Cox had negotiated a lesser sentence in return for his cooperation. They also pointed to inconsistencies in witness statements and a lack of forensic corroboration. Despite these arguments, the jury convicted Boyd of capital murder during a kidnapping. After Boyd's conviction, the trial moved into the penalty phase. Alabama law at the time allowed a death sentence to be imposed with a jury recommendation by a 10-2 vote. In Boyd's case, the jury recommended the death penalty by a 10-2 margin, and the judge formally imposed that sentence. Boyd was then transferred to death row at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility, where he awaited execution for the next 30 years while pursuing appeals and legal challenges. For more than 3 decades following his sentencing, Boyd remained incarcerated on Alabama's death row. His legal representatives filed numerous appeals in both state and federal courts, challenging aspects of his conviction, the adequacy of his legal representation, and later, the state's chosen method of execution. One recurring legal challenge focused on the constitutionality of nitrogen hypoxia as an execution method, with attorneys arguing that it constituted cruel and unusual punishment, in violation of the Eighth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. In particular, they cited prior nitrogen gas executions that had involved extended convulsions, gasping, and other physical reactions, asserting that the method caused unnecessary suffering. Boyd's counsel also sought to withdraw his initial selection of nitrogen hypoxia on the grounds that he had not been adequately informed about the method when he first chose it, and later tried to revoke that choice. These legal disputes reached federal district and appellate courts, but judges consistently denied requests for a stay or reprieve. In the days before his execution date, Boyd's legal team filed a final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, asking for a stay or a change in method. The Supreme Court declined to grant a stay, with a noted dissent by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who argued that the nitrogen gas method could violate the Eighth Amendment, and that Boyd would be conscious for many minutes before death. In the weeks and months before October 23, 2025, Alabama officials finalized preparations for Boyd's execution. The Alabama Department of Corrections and the governor's office set an execution window, arranged media and witness schedules, and coordinated customary procedural steps for carrying out capital punishment. Boyd, who had spent his adult life behind bars after the 1995 conviction, received visitors and phone calls in the days leading up to the execution date, according to reporting on Inmate Procedures. In the final hours before execution, he declined a final meal and made final contacts with family and spiritual advisors. On Thursday, October 23, 2025, Boyd was escorted to the execution chamber at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility. Witnesses included state officials, media representatives, legal counsel, and a small number of family members. According to press reporting, the nitrogen gas began to flow at approximately 5:57 p.m. local time. Observers described Boyd experiencing physical reactions including clenched fists, gasping breaths, and movement of his legs in response to the lack of oxygen after gas administration. Movement and gasping continued for several minutes before Boyd became still. Boyd was pronounced dead at approximately 6:33 p.m., marking the completion of the execution process under Alabama's nitrogen hypoxia protocol. Before the gas was administered, Boyd delivered final remarks reflecting his perspective on the justice system and his own conviction. According to reporting by the Associated Press and other outlets, "I didn't kill anybody. I didn't participate in killing anybody," Boyd said, maintaining his innocence. "There can be no justice until we change this system. Let's get it." His final words criticized the criminal justice system and expressed support for those continuing to advocate for change. The execution of Anthony Todd Boyd elicited reactions from advocates on both sides of the death penalty debate. Supporters of the execution, including Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall, reiterated the state's commitment to carrying out legally imposed sentences in accordance with the law, and framed the execution as justice rendered for the victim's family. Critics, including civil rights organizations and legal commentators, highlighted concerns about the reliance on eyewitness testimony without physical evidence, as well as arguments about nitrogen hypoxia's constitutionality and its physical effects during executions. Some allies cited Boyd's claims of innocence as part of broader critiques of the death penalty and systemic inequities in capital punishment administration. The dissenting opinion by Justice Sonia Sotomayor in the Supreme Court's denial of a stay underscored these ongoing concerns, asserting that nitrogen hypoxia could cause prolonged suffering and highlighting constitutional questions. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to read them. Subscribe and share the link to your friends. Thanks once again, and hopefully I will see you on the next one.